Hello and welcome to Cognitive Drift. Sometimes doubt arrives quietly. It doesn't always come from some big philosophical crisis or a life-shaking event. Sometimes it's just a feeling. A line in a sermon that doesn't quite land, a story in scripture that sounds more like a fable than a fact, or a moment in prayer where you realize you're not sure who or what you're talking to. Doubt isn't loud. It doesn't shout. It whispers. And in most other parts of life, we're allowed to listen to that whisper. If you doubt a scientific claim, you investigate. If you doubt a historical account, you dig deeper. If you doubt your own opinion, that's seen as thoughtful. But when it comes to religion, that same instinct is often treated like a disease. There's a reason for that. Religion, most religion anyway, isn't built to accommodate doubt. It's built to manage it, control it, and if possible, eliminate it. The way many religious systems handle doubt isn't with open discussion, but with insulation. Questions aren't met with exploration, they're redirected, or worse, moralized. You start to doubt, and suddenly it's not just an intellectual issue, it's a spiritual one. Something wrong with you, not with the belief. And this shift from asking questions to being the problem, that's where things get heavy. That's where the social pressure kicks in. Because religious doubt doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens inside families, communities, institutions, where belief is tied to belonging, where questioning isn't just seen as thinking, it's seen as disloyalty. That's why so many people sit with their doubts in silence. They don't want to rock the boat. They don't want to upset their parents, disappoint their pastor, or lose the sense of community they've had for years. So what do religions typically do? They get ahead of the doubt. They set up psychological tripwires. You'll hear phrases like, lean not on your own understanding, or doubt is the devil's tool, or those who question are already on a dangerous path. These aren't just lines. They're preemptive strikes. They turn curiosity into sin before it even forms into a full thought. And from an outside perspective, it's easy to see why. Because if a belief system depends on total trust, if salvation is on the line and faith is the only ticket, then doubt isn't just inconvenient, it's existential. You can't afford to have people start asking whether Noah really got all those animals on a boat, or why an all-loving God would order genocide, or why a soul's eternal fate would depend on geography and birth. Those kinds of questions aren't just theological, they're destabilizing, because once someone starts really thinking them through, once they follow the doubt instead of suppressing it, the whole structure starts to wobble. So instead of encouraging investigation, many religious systems inoculate against it. They teach obedience early, they reward conformity, they use repetition, ritual, and fear of consequence to cement belief before doubt even gets a foothold. It's not always intentional. Often it's just the way the system reproduces itself. Parents pass down what they were taught, communities reinforce what feels safe and familiar, leaders do what's expected, everyone plays their part, and doubt gets pushed into the shadows, but it never really disappears because people are curious. We're built to question, to notice when things don't add up, to test stories against experience. And when religion tells you not to do that, not to trust your own reasoning, it's not just controlling your beliefs, it's asking you to turn off part of yourself. And once you've been taught to distrust your own thoughts, your own instincts, it's hard to even know what's real anymore. You start to second-guess the questions themselves, not because they're unreasonable, but because you've been trained to feel guilty for even having them. It's like your internal compass is trying to point somewhere and you've been told it's a sin to follow it. That kind of internal conflict is exhausting. You feel the weight of your doubt, but you also feel like you're betraying something sacred just by acknowledging it. So you do what many people do, you pretend it's not there. You compartmentalize. You recite the lines, you keep going through the motions, but deep down, there's that quiet discomfort, that small but growing sense that something doesn't quite fit, that there's a disconnect between what you believe and what you actually think. What's fascinating is that religion doesn't just discourage doubt, it often tries to rebrand it, to reinterpret it. You'll hear things like, even the greatest believers had doubts. But that usually comes with a condition. The doubt has to end in renewed faith. It's not real permission to question. It's a controlled journey where the destination is already chosen. You're allowed to wander a little as long as you come back, as long as you land in the right place. But real doubt doesn't work that way. It doesn't follow a script. It's not a dramatic scene in a movie where the character has a crisis and then finds clarity in a sunset. Real doubt it's messy. It's slow. It's quiet. And it doesn't always resolve the way others want it to. And that's where things get uncomfortable. Because many religions can't tolerate unresolved doubt. You either believe or you don't. And if you're in between, that makes you a problem, not just for yourself, but for others, for the group. And once you start becoming a problem for the group, that's when the pressure starts to build. You might not be punished directly, but you'll feel it. The silence, the side glances, the subtle exclusion, the way people start avoiding certain topics with you, the way they suggest you pray harder or stop reading so much or just have faith. It's rarely about engaging with your actual thoughts. It's about steering you back into line. Because in a tightly knit religious community, belief isn't just personal, it's social glue. When someone starts to question, it threatens that glue. It raises the possibility that maybe others are feeling the same thing and just haven't said it yet. So there's a built-in defense mechanism. One doubter is a concern, but two, that's a crack in the wall. That's why doubt is often treated as contagious, dangerous, and why religious systems will respond to it with intensity, not because they're evil or cruel, but because they're designed to preserve themselves, and doubt is a threat to preservation. But let's pause here and be fair. Not all doubt is dismissed. Some religious thinkers, usually the more liberal or philosophical ones, do try to engage with it. They write books, they wrestle with contradictions, they explore mystery, they try to hold space for not knowing. And sometimes that can be helpful. It can open doors, it can slow down the anxiety, it can remind you that you're not alone. But even in those spaces, there's usually an unspoken boundary. You can question, but only within the frame, within the basic assumptions. You can reinterpret the text, but don't discard it. You can challenge tradition, but don't abandon the faith entirely. It's like rearranging furniture in a house that you're never allowed to leave. So for those who start to feel that the whole structure just doesn't hold anymore, those boundaries become walls. And what began as a question becomes a crossroads. Do you stay and keep pretending, or do you walk away and risk everything that came with belonging? For many, that's not an easy choice, and that says something. Because if an idea is only safe as long as you don't question it, what does that really say about the idea? That's the thing about belief systems that depend on certainty. They don't leave much room for evolution. They're built to be complete, closed, finished. And when something is framed as ultimate truth, untouchable, unquestionable, it stops growing. And anything that stops growing starts to crack under pressure. You can see it in the way religions often respond to challenges from science, or history, or even basic logic. They don't revise, they reinterpret, they retrofit. And when that doesn't work, they retreat into metaphor. What was once a literal story becomes a symbolic one, not because that's what it always was, but because the literal version doesn't hold up anymore. And that's one of the quieter ways religion handles doubt, by moving the goalposts, shifting the terms. What was once considered essential becomes optional. What was once taken as fact becomes a matter of faith. But even that flexibility has limits. You can soften the edges, but the core claims still remain. And at some point the question comes back, do I actually believe this? Or am I just afraid to stop? Because fear is a huge part of how doubt is managed. Not just fear of hell, though that's a big one, but fear of being wrong, fear of losing community, fear of losing meaning, fear of disappointing people you love, fear of stepping into a world where there are no easy answers. Religions know this. They've had thousands of years to fine-tune it. That's why so many of them have built-in warnings about apostasy, about falling away, not just as a mistake, but as a dangerous act, a betrayal, a fall from grace. That language sticks with people. Even long after they stop believing, that emotional residue doesn't just fade, it lingers. That's why so many former believers still carry a kind of guilt. Even when they know, rationally, they've done nothing wrong. It's not just about facts. It's about identity, about the stories you were raised with, about the version of yourself that existed before the questions started. And when you begin to step away from that, you're not just walking away from beliefs. You're leaving behind a whole version of your life, and yet many do it anyway. Not because they want to, not because it's easy, but because at some point, the cost of pretending becomes heavier than the cost of honesty. And that's what religion often struggles to handle, not just doubt itself, but doubt that persists, that doesn't go away with a verse or a prayer, doubt that leads to a genuine change in belief. Because in those moments, the system doesn't know what to do with you. You're not just a backslider, you're not just going through a phase, you're someone who asked the questions, followed them, and landed somewhere else. And for a system that claims universal truth, that's a problem. It's easier to believe that doubters are broken than to consider that the system itself might be incomplete. So often, the response is dismissal or demonization, or silence. Families pull back, friends fade out, leaders wash their hands. You become someone they pray for or avoid or quietly judge from a distance. Always, but often enough. And that silence, that sudden loss of connection, can be more painful than the loss of belief itself. But here's the thing no one tells you when you're in. Doubt isn't the end of something, it's the beginning. Because doubt isn't just about breaking something down. It's about clearing space to build something better. Not something perfect, not something that claims to have all the answers, but something real, something earned, something honest. When you grow up inside a belief system that discourages questioning, you learn to measure yourself by how little you waver, how well you can suppress the inner voice that says, this doesn't make sense. But the moment you stop doing that, the moment you allow yourself to listen, you shift from obedience to awareness, and that's a powerful thing. But it's also vulnerable, because stepping away from certainty, especially when everyone around you still clings to it, can be isolating. It's not just about rejecting an idea. It's about stepping into ambiguity, into not knowing, into rebuilding your view of life from the ground up. And religion, at least in its more traditional forms, has very few tools for helping someone do that. If anything, it teaches the opposite. That uncertainty is failure, that not knowing is weakness, that faith means holding on even when the evidence slips away. That creates a strange kind of paralysis, because the very act of seeking truth, honestly, humbly, without a predetermined answer, is painted as rebellion, and in that framing, the only good doubter is the one who comes back, the one who confesses, repents, recommits. But what about those who don't come back? What if the doubts weren't a phase, but a realization? What if the journey away from belief wasn't a fall, but a growth? Those questions rarely get space in religious environments, because once doubt reaches that point, it stops being something that can be safely managed. It becomes contagious. That's why people who leave are often erased. treated as cautionary tales, or just quietly forgotten, not because they were cruel, not because they did anything wrong, but because their presence is a reminder that faith is not automatic, that belief doesn't always hold, that people, even good, sincere people, sometimes stop believing and live meaningful, ethical, joyful lives anyway. And that's hard for a system that insists it has a monopoly on truth. So instead of making room for doubt, religion often builds fences, emotional, intellectual, and social fences, designed not just to keep people in, but to keep certain questions out. And those fences work for a while, but here's the deeper irony. The more you have to protect an idea from doubt, the more fragile that idea starts to look. Because truth doesn't fear questions. Truth can handle scrutiny. Truth doesn't need to be defended with threats or guilt or fear. It can stand on its own. And when a belief system reacts to doubt with defensiveness or shame or punishment, it tells you something not about you, but about the belief itself. Because when something is really true, you don't have to be afraid of where the questions lead. But that's the tension, isn't it? Religion isn't just a set of claims. It's a structure, a system, a way of life. And the deeper you're embedded in it, the more it shapes your lens, the way you see yourself, others, the world, even your own thoughts. So when doubt shows up, it doesn't just poke at a few beliefs. It shakes the whole framework. And for a lot of people, that's terrifying. That's why some will fight to protect the story even when they no longer fully believe it. Not out of ignorance, but out of fear. Because when you've built your life on a foundation, and that foundation starts to crumble, it's hard not to panic. And religion knows this. It banks on it. It doesn't just offer answers. It offers security, community, identity, belonging. And so letting go of belief doesn't just mean changing your mind. It means stepping out of the tribe. That's why doubt is so often met with concern that isn't really about the content of your questions. It's about keeping you in the fold. It might come in the form of gentle correction, or an emotional appeal, or sometimes just a quiet, cold shoulder, not because people are cruel, but because they're scared of what your doubt says about their own beliefs, scared of what it might mean if you're right, or even just partially right. That's what makes doubt feel so lonely, not just because you're questioning something sacred, but because you're doing it in a space where everyone is trained not to. You'll hear lines like, "Don't lean on your own understanding," or "God's ways are higher than ours." And these phrases are meant to shut the door before the question even walks in. But what they really do is teach people to doubt themselves instead of the idea. And that's the quiet damage, because when you're told that questioning is a spiritual weakness, you start to internalize that weakness. You start to believe that something's wrong with you, that if you were stronger, holier, more faithful, you wouldn't be having these thoughts. And so the instinct to explore, the same instinct that drives science, philosophy, art, and human progress, gets turned inward as shame. That's not just a theological issue. That's psychological, and it keeps people stuck, not because they're convinced, but because they're afraid to move. But at some point, for many people, the tension becomes too much. The weight of pretending gets heavier than the risk of honesty. And when they finally let themselves follow their thoughts wherever they lead, there's often grief, but also relief. Because the thing about doubt is that it doesn't always destroy. Sometimes it liberates. It clears away what no longer holds, so something more grounded, more true to experience, can grow in its place. That part of the process rarely gets talked about inside religion, because from within, leaving is seen as failure. But from outside, it can look like growth, and growth doesn't always come with certainty. Sometimes it means learning to live with not knowing, and being okay with that. And that living with not knowing, is something religion struggles to make room for, because most religious systems aren't built to help people sit with uncertainty. They're built to resolve it, to offer answers, definitive ones, wrapped in meaning, delivered with authority. That can be comforting, especially when life gets hard, when the world feels chaotic, when people are looking for something solid to hold on to. But not all answers are created equal. Some are handed down with no room for disagreement. Others are stitched together to preserve tradition, not truth. And when people start to sense that, when the answers start to feel less like insight and more like insulation, the doubt creeps in, not out of arrogance, not out of rebellion, but out of honesty. Because sometimes the most faithful thing a person can do is be honest about what they no longer believe. But religion doesn't usually frame it that way. It's not designed to reward intellectual honesty when that honesty points away from the doctrine. Instead, it often spiritualizes the doubt, reframes it as a test, a trial, something you're supposed to endure until you come out the other side with your faith intact. And that framing makes it hard to leave, because now, walking away isn't just about following your reasoning, it's about failing the test. That's a powerful psychological trap. You start to wonder, am I just being weak? Am I letting my emotions or ego get in the way? Should I push through, like they say? But when you look closer, you see that it's not your reasoning that's the problem. It's that your reasoning is pointing you somewhere inconvenient. And when that happens, you have a choice. You can suppress it, silence it, double down on the belief that doubting is wrong, or you can trust yourself. That's a hard move to make when you've spent years, maybe decades, being told that self-trust is pride, that your heart is deceitful, that human understanding is limited and flawed. But here's the irony. All understanding is human. All belief systems, including religion, are interpreted and taught and passed on by people. So the idea that doubt is somehow uniquely untrustworthy, while belief is somehow pure, doesn't really hold up. They both come from the same place, human minds trying to make sense of the world. The only difference is that doubt doesn't pretend to have all the answers. It doesn't offer promises it can't prove. It doesn't claim divine backing. It just says, this doesn't make sense to me, and I want to understand why. And that question, that impulse to understand, is not the enemy of meaning. It's the beginning of it. Because real meaning doesn't need to be protected from doubt. It can survive it. In fact, it often emerges because of it. Some of the most thoughtful, compassionate, and deeply grounded people you'll ever meet are those who've walked through doubt, not around it. People who didn't run from their questions, but followed them, even when it cost them comfort, even when it meant losing the safety of certainty. And it does cost something, let's not pretend otherwise. Leaving behind a belief system, especially one tied to your upbringing, your culture, your family, is a kind of grief. You're not just letting go of a god or a doctrine, you're letting go of a version of yourself, a story you once lived inside. And in many religious contexts, there's no ritual for that, no permission to mourn it. You're just supposed to leave quietly or not at all. That silence is part of how religion handles doubt. It doesn't always confront it directly. Sometimes it just starves it of air, makes it invisible, keeps it out of sermons, out of conversation, out of sight. And when doubt does become visible, when someone speaks up or starts slipping away, the response is often about damage control. Pull them back, fix the problem, contain the leak. Rarely is the system itself re-examined, because that's not how most religions are designed. They're not built to evolve with new evidence. They're built to endure, to preserve, to repeat. The stories are sacred not because they're always reasonable, but because they're old and familiar and loaded with emotional weight. So when doubt shows up, especially doubt that leads someone out, it can feel like an attack on the entire tradition, a betrayal. Even if the person leaving is kind, thoughtful, respectful, their very existence challenges the narrative. That's why so many people who step away from religion don't do it with fanfare. They do it quietly, slowly. They fade out rather than burn bridges. Because they know how fragile those relationships can be once belief is no longer shared. And that quiet exodus is something religions rarely talk about, but it's happening all over the world, not because people are angry or rebellious, but because people are asking honest questions and not finding honest answers. And the more a religion punishes or ignores those questions, the more people realize they have to go elsewhere, not just to find new beliefs, but to find themselves again. And that's really what it comes down to. Doubt, at its core, isn't about tearing something down. It's about making space for truth, whatever that turns out to be. But for that to happen, doubt needs oxygen, it needs room, it needs freedom. And many religious systems just aren't built for that. They're built for consistency, for tradition, for certainty. Which makes sense in a way. Those things are comforting. They make life feel stable. They help people feel rooted in something bigger than themselves. But when that comfort starts to come at the cost of honesty, when the story has to be protected from basic questions, when curiosity is treated like a threat, something's gone wrong. Because if you can't question an idea without fear, it's not faith, it's control. And if you stay in a belief system only because you're afraid of what will happen if you leave, then that's not belief. That's survival. And for anyone who's gone through that, anyone who's asked the hard questions, felt the tension, wrestled with the silence, and kept going anyway, that's not weakness. That's strength, not the kind that needs applause or validation or even certainty, just the quiet strength it takes to be honest with yourself when honesty comes with a cost. So how does religion handle doubt? Really, usually it contains it, redirects it, silences it, frames it as sin or a test or a phase. But what it rarely does is trust it. And that's the difference. Because doubt isn't the opposite of meaning. It's how we find meaning that's actually worth holding on to. Not because someone told us to believe it, but because it stood up to the question and still made sense. And that, more than any promise of reward or threat of punishment, is what makes something truly worth believing, worth letting go,